In the late 1700s, a lot of things were happening to the 13 original colonies. The state of North Carolina included all of the land west to the Mississippi, which of course included what is now the state of Tennessee. As if the boundaries around here weren't already messed up enough, in 1784 the area that is now northeast Tennessee, called the Washington District, broke off from North Carolina and formed the state of Franklin. But the state of Franklin wasn't going to be allowed to be part of the Union, so just 5 years later, that area again became part of North Carolina. But in 1790, the state of North Carolina ceded the area west of the Smokies to the federal government, and it became known as the Southwest Territory. And only 6 years later, that section of land was accepted into the Union as the state of Tennessee. But around 1802, the area started seeing some growth, and an accurate survey was taken that laid the state line somewhere between the center of what would become State Street and what would be the base of these existing buildings on the Virginia side of town. That boundary was understood to be the official state line, even though it completely ignored the original King Charles II latitude. The inaccurate surveys had established that state line for just too long, and it was now accepted as the official state line, and the new survey made it law. This area was considered the American frontier. There wasn't much here except the natural topography that guided historic tribal pathways up the Great Valley. And those pathways were becoming active stagecoach lines, connecting the American eastern cities in the north and the south. 50 years later, a lot of eyes were on that stretch of land that traversed between the Cumberland Mountains to the northwest and the Great Smoky Mountains to the southeast. This state line going directly across the most direct north-south passage in this growing country had promise.
And Joseph Anderson, he went out and surveyed what is now the downtown Bristol area to form a town. But he took the Compromise of 1850, which is a congressional report, showing exactly where the state line was. And he put his main street down the 1850 state line compromise, but within Tennessee. So the buildings that were built right on the state line on the Virginia side were actually right on the state line, with the street in front of it all being in Tennessee.
Joseph Anderson intended for the main street to be entirely within the state of Tennessee. I think conventional wisdom is that it was going to be easier for Anderson to work out railroad crossings such as we have at State Street if he's dealing with one state.
Which meant that Virginia would be giving up the north half of State Street. And that brings us back to the fight in the muddy ditch on State Street.
They really had an armed standoff on who was going to prevail, and ended up in a little bit of a scuffle among law enforcement authorities from both sides, and it ended when someone fell into the muddy pit that they were fussing over, and they all had a laugh out of that and walked away and decided to resolve that dispute through the court system rather than through armed conflict. Interestingly, both councils, city, Bristol, Tennessee, or town, and Goodson, in 1881, both decided it would be more appropriate to have it in the middle of the main street, but they had no authority to do that. But each council had actually adopted a resolution to that effect.
9 years later, Rufus Ayers, a native of Goodson, had become the Attorney General of the Commonwealth of Virginia and initiated a lawsuit between Virginia and Tennessee. He wanted it all the way south to the original latitude that the king, who had never visited, had laid out 225 years earlier.
So Virginia contended the only remedy the Supreme Court should follow would be to go back to the King Charles Charter, declare the boundary was 36 degrees 30 minutes north latitude, appoint surveyors to run the line and do it. In 1893, the Supreme Court, their declaration was, you all agreed in 1802 where the line was. In essence, Congress had recognized that boundary line. So there was an implied ratification of that.
But all that effort decided was that the state line wasn't the original King Charles II's designated border. So again, it was somewhere between the center of the main street and the base of the buildings on the Virginia side. And this is even after the two city councils had agreed to have the state line down the center of State Street. So it was about to go back to the Supreme Court when the state of Tennessee capitulated.
In 1901, cooler heads prevailed, and the state of Tennessee formally ceded the land north of the middle of Main Street in Bristol to Virginia. Virginia accepted it, and Congress officially ratified it. That ratification was, I believe, March 3, 1901, and then 1903 the Supreme Court entered an order officially ratifying that action as well, and that has resolved the issue from a legal standpoint.
So judging from all the festivals and car shows and parades that we have, splitting the city into two cities and states, and we do it many times all summer, we've learned to cooperate. The two cities have learned to work together, as have the counties of Washington and Sullivan. If you've enjoyed this episode of Forged in History or have a suggestion for a future episode, let us know. You can contact us at the City of Bristol, Tennessee's Facebook page or the city's website at www.bristoltn.org.